with this. Well, newly crowned WBO super featherweight champion Mikaela Mayer took to Twitter and asked, why are the long-standing champs in my division both scheduled to fight number 30 and number 28 ranked fighters this month? In the most stacked division of women's boxing, can someone answer that? And the answer to that question is simple. The reason that Kourouni Choi and Maeva Hamadouche are taking on lighter touches for their next fights is because neither of those fighters have fought in a year. It's been over 12 months since those fighters saw any action. In those situations, it's quite customary that the fighter, whether that fighter is a contender or a world champion, it's customary that the fighter take on a lighter touch to ease themselves back into activity, as you don't want to take on too much too soon coming off a stint of inactivity. Moreover, Mikaela Mayer hasn't been inactive. Mikaela Mayer has fought in the last 12 months. And now that she's become a world champion herself, who is her next opponent going to be? Mikaela Jocelyn Mayer fought 2 times this year. She fought Helen Joseph back in July, and very recently she took on the then unbeaten world champion, WBO champion, Eva Brutnicka. So, Mikaela Mayer, she doesn't have that excuse. The excuse that Kourouni Choi has, the excuse that Maeva Hamadouche has. Those fighters haven't fought in over 12 months. She has. That being said, who is Mikaela going to fight in her very next fight? We are approaching the end of 2020, and before the year is out, both of these world champions will get back into action. That basically sets the stage for what could be unification matches in early 2021. Terry Harper, in so many words, stated that her very next fight could be a unification match. Hypothetically speaking, if Terry and Kourouni Choi, provided that Kourouni makes it through this tune-up, and I think she will, but if she does, and she so decides to unify with Terry Harper in what is her very next fight, is Mikaela open to unifying with Maeva Hamadouche? Because Maeva Hamadouche volunteered herself to fight Mikaela.
And Mikaela said she wants to save her for last.
Those were Mikaela Mayer's own words. I think, given that we're approaching the end of the year, that's a legitimate question to ask. If Terry Harper and Kourouni Choi end up unifying in early 2021, would Mikaela Mayer be receptive to a Maeva Hamadouche fight? Maeva Hamadouche isn't bashful. She doesn't beat around the bush. Before COVID hit, she was going to fly into Kourouni Choi's neck of the woods to take her on. Maeva has always been receptive to a fight with most anyone and everyone, and I think the question needs to be asked. If Terry Harper unifies with Kourouni Choi in early 2021, would Mikaela be receptive to a Maeva Hamadouche fight? Because if you're going to criticize her for who she's fighting...
If that bothers you.
What, would you like that opportunity? Would you like to fight her?
Hey, that's a legitimate question.
And just in keeping with the theme of news coming out of the super featherweight division, Kourouni and Steffi Bull, who trains Terry Harper, they had a very spicy exchange via Twitter in the last couple of days. Kalia said, Steffi Bull, shut up, because if you were a real coach, you'd never talk to a boxer like this. Or play with social all day. Legends have lost it. And what? Because I have 2 losses on points in paper as an underdog, so what? Promise, you tell Eddie Hearn I fight for free, and you will see what means Spartan balls. To which Steffi Bull replied, quote-unquote, Pink Tyson, what's your excuse for only winning this one by 1 point? Hashtag deluded. To which Kalia replied, okay, let's see then. I will fight you for free. I fucking already told you. If you are sure, let's do it. Will be a gift for you. The same you told for Tasha Jonas. But all we...
What?
Emojis, only you cry. The least I am proud, no loss, and take draw. Talk Alessandro Gelki. I fight for free. To which Steffi Bull replied, Terry would beat you with one hand, quote-unquote, Pink Tyson. And this went on for a while. Terry Harper herself participated in the fiasco. Terry said, I'll beat you with no hands. To which Kourouni replied, I don't understand why you continue this shit. You are sure she can beat me with one hand? Okay, let's do it. And I don't want money. Why don't you accept? Talking are cheap, but the boxing history many times show us the cheap can talk and be wrong. This was all likely sparked by Steffi Bull's recent comments about what purse amounts many of these challengers are willing to accept during COVID times. Steffi, in so many words, felt that $20,000 to $25,000 in this current landscape for a challenger not a champion.
It's good money and it's a good offer.
That was a reasonable offer, that was a reasonable amount of money, at least according to Steffi, but not to Heather Hardy and not to Kourouni. It's likely what got the ball rolling here. There was also some talk of Terry Harper having stopped Katharina Sanders, some comments from Katharina post-fight.
It's a mess.
But I'll tell you the truth. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because in spite of the overall spiciness of this exchange between Steffi and Terry and Kalia, what have you, it's not going to materialize in a fight. It's not. Terry Harper, in so many words, which I said already, she's set to unify with another world champion like herself in early 2021, and in all likelihood, it could be Hyun Mi Choi. So whatever is being said now won't materialize into a fight later, at least not in the immediate future. Now, perhaps, if Kalia Kourouni can continue to stay in the winner's bracket, perhaps this is a fight that can be explored after Terry Harper's next fight. But as far as the here and now, this thing ain't getting off the ground.
Doesn't matter what's being said.
Or who's saying it. And if what's being said isn't going to result in a fight, then it's much ado about nothing. Kalia's issue seems to have been that she was contacted for a potential Hyun Mi Choi fight, and it wasn't so much the money that bothered her. The money was fine, but it was the notice. 10 days notice to take on an active reigning world champion. That being said, perhaps a Terry Harper fight in the future is a possibility that can be explored, can be revisited.
When Kalia's had more time to prepare.
I don't disagree that, Kalia does have a point. A fighter that takes on a fight on that kind of notice isn't taking on the fight because they think they can win. They'd be taking on the fight for a check. No more, no less. So I understand where she's coming from, but ultimately this exchange between her and Steffi and Terry, here and now, is much ado about nothing because it's not going to materialize. It's not going to result in a fight.
Not yet, anyway.
The women's super featherweight division continues to be the hottest division in the sport of women's boxing.
I guess you call them freak show fights, but there was a rumor out of Quebec that you were looking at finally launching Zuffa Boxing with Claressa Shields headlining event. Claressa has since signed with the PFL. Were you guys in negotiations with Claressa Shields, and is Zuffa Boxing kind of on hold again for now?
Never did I say that I was doing anything, but I've been looking and kicking the tires of boxing, for the last couple of years. And the reason you've never seen me do anything is because that's how screwed up and broken it is. That's what a mess it is. I'm not doing anything anytime soon.
Is it just kind of too late to get into boxing because of all these weird governing bodies and all the WBC, WBA belts and all these different promotions having their hand in the cookie jar? Is it kind of just too late to be able to do it successfully, in your opinion?
Maybe, yeah, maybe it might be. It's going to require so much time, money, and the whole thing needs to be rebuilt and restructured. There's always going to be fights that'll pop up that'll make money, But when you're in a situation where, a fight like this Mayweather fight does more buys than Fury versus Wilder, or some of these legitimate big fights, it's pretty scary.
These excerpts from Dana White, one question as to whether or not he's going to take a stab at getting Zuffa Boxing off the ground, entering into the sport of boxing, attempting to do for boxing what he did for mixed martial arts. Talking about Dana White. These excerpts from Dana, these comments, touch on a subject, a prevalent subject that we've been discussing here on the channel many times
this week,
in the last couple of days, that, boxing just doesn't want to save itself. Its infrastructure, it is fragmented, it is divided, and it is broken. That, you often hear it said that in the UFC, the best fight the best, and that's true to some extent, but it's only true because all of those fighters are fighting under the same promotional banner. They're all UFC fighters. Whereas in boxing, the issue with boxing is that different fighters are with different promoters and
but have different network affiliates.
and that's just one problem, of which there are several. You have alphabet organizations, sanctioning bodies, running wild, out of control. Look at what the WBC just did. They just added a weight class between cruiserweight and heavyweight when nobody was fucking asking them to. Not the fans, not the fighters, not anybody. But Mauricio Suleiman has so taken it upon himself to come up with this bridger weight division.
Stupid ass
And,
shit.
I stand by my original opinion that the only reason they decided to do this is because more weight classes means more trinket titles, and more trinket titles mean more sanctioning fees that go to the organization. These sanctioning bodies aren't cooking up new weight classes, unnecessary weight classes. They're mass-producing trinket titles, thereby diluting divisions and lessening the meaning of what it means to be a champion, to be an active reigning world champion in the sport of boxing. It doesn't mean as much when you got 5 and 6 and 7 guys running around with belts that look just like yours.
Where's the exclusivity?
Where's the prestige in that when you got, at any given time, 5 and 6 and 7 guys running around with belts? Boxing is no longer a mainstream sport, and it hurts me to say that, but that's the truth. It's not a sport that's at the forefront of the American sporting world where it used to be. It's just not as hot a ticket as what it was in previous eras, and Dana White is right. He can't fix this.
Well, I was never expecting him to.
And anyone that was is rather presumptuous, to say the least. This is a bigger problem than he can fix. The idea that he could do for boxing what he did to the UFC is pretty fucking ridiculous. Because the only reason the UFC operates the way it does is because Dana holds all the contracts to all of those fighters, whereas boxing is a much bigger sport that involves that many more promotional outfits, that many more networks
Around the world.
I think the biggest problem that boxing faces, what needs to change and what needs to change immediately, isn't so much the fiascos we see involving these alphabet organizations, these sanctioning bodies. That's not really what the bane of boxing is here and now. The real bane of boxing is that fights that need to happen don't happen. They don't happen soon or often enough. Case in point, we got a bunch of guys celebrating Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view numbers with Danny Garcia as if 250,000 pay-per-view buys, at just a little over that, is somehow the benchmark of a superstar.
You kidding me?
And look at how this story is being reported. If you ask Mike Kopinger, it's the greatest fucking news in the world, when in reality, all this shows is that Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view buys from the time he debuted with Mikey Garcia till now have nosedived. You're talking about going from 360,000 pay-per-view buys, almost 400,000.
They're not being able to break 300,000.
That's what we're talking about. This is a numbers game, and look at the numbers. When Errol Spence Jr. debuted on pay-per-view, he brought in about 360,000 pay-per-view buys with Mikey Garcia.
Exactly.
And from then till now, what are the numbers? 250,000 or just a little over 250,000? And don't ask Bob Arum about it, because what Bob Arum is saying is that they are inflating the numbers, that it didn't even actually do that much. And you know what? I feel so inclined to believe him. But we'll discuss Bob and his comments about it in another video. For now, you see how they're celebrating this mediocrity? This is boxing's problem, because they celebrate this mediocrity to create the illusion that Errol doesn't need Terrence. When the fight with Terrence, that's the fight that the fans are actually asking you for. And in all likelihood, that's the fight that would bring you in more money than any of these alternatives and substitutes you've been staging for Errol Spence Jr. You're actually ignoring your consumers.
And that's the problem.
You're ignoring your own customers, your own paying public. The question here is why? Well, greed comes to mind almost immediately. I mean, look at what these guys are trying to do. They're essentially trying to keep you excited, keep you enthusiastic about a Spence versus Terrence Crawford fight without actually giving you that fight. They dangle that fight in front of you while charging you inflated pay-per-view prices for what are alternatives, substitutes, essentially gouging the average boxing fan. And what this does is it deters that audience, because they don't want to have to pay $80 every time to see a goddamn fight. I told you, I got nothing against Errol Spence Jr. needing a tune-up, having spent more than 12 months away from the ring. If he needs a tune-up, I think he should have one. But what I don't think is that it should cost anyone $80 to see. Danny Garcia ain't pay-per-view worthy, but what do?
Charge you $80 to watch him survive.
You want my honest opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, because I didn't come to you. You came to me. If you want my opinion, that fight would have been better suited as a freebie staged on Fox, regular Fox, where you can gain access to that many more homes, that many more viewers, and thereby organically raise a fighter's overall marquee value, as that many more people will be acquainted with that fighter depending on how many homes that fighter can reach with that fighter's fights. If you ask me, Errol Spence Jr.'s ring return should have been staged on Fox, and I'm confident that a fight like that likely would have brought in upwards of 3 to 4 million viewers.
Maybe more.
But greed in and of itself has its role to play. Look at how many pay-per-views the PBC has staged in the course of 1 year. The Wilder vs. Fury rematch was a pay-per-view. Then you got another pay-per-view between Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz. Another pay-per-view between the Charlo brothers, the Charlo doubleheader, and yet another pay-per-view involving Errol Spence Jr. and Danny Garcia. And each one of these pay-per-views cost the average boxing fan close to $100. How much are you expecting the common man to pay to see the sport of boxing? You're not making it accessible to the average fight fan. If anything, you're causing that audience to shrink.
And they don't care.
Because they treat boxing like it's an overnight sale. You've got promotional outfits and pundits embellishing pay-per-view numbers to create the illusion that they have all these stars, all these A-listers. And as a result, the fighters end up with an inflated sense of self, these delusions of grandeur that far exceed their actual marquee value. All these guys, they think they've arrived already. They think they're too good for every fucking thing.
And this promotes division.
They get to thinking that they don't need to fight this guy. They don't need to unify titles with that guy. And what are the fights that bring eyes and attention to the sport? And the industry overall suffers for it.
Think Dana White was going to fix that?
Fat fucking chance. His endeavor with Zuffa Boxing would likely have been alienated and run out of the sport by the promotional outfits that are already there.
He never stood a chance.
And neither will the sport of boxing with the common man if something doesn't change.